Okay, chapter 7 was all about measurement and the different procedures that researchers go through to make sure that the tools and the instruments that they are using are reliable and valid and are measuring the constructs that they are hoping to measure. So the chapter starts off by talking about different scales. So when you are identifying the variables, either in an article that you're reviewing or in your own research design, it's helpful to think about the type of scale that you are using, and that will help you understand the type of data that you are collecting. So anomial scale is used when it is not numerical data, so categories. An ordinal scale is used when you are ranking objects or individuals compared to each other. And then interval ranking means, or scale, is when the distance between each measure is the same. And the example they gave in the test is like the Fahrenheit test or Fahrenheit temperature measure or Celsius. And another one that I'm thinking of is like the MAPS assessment where the interval is the same. And then ratio is when there is a true 0 point. So if you are giving a test and it's you could have a score from 0 to 100, like percentages, or things like weight and height. So this is something that you can use in your article critique. Even if the author doesn't describe the type of scale that they used, you can use what you learned in this chapter and use that to talk about the scales and the variables that they were collecting to describe the type of data that they were using. Now, next, the authors talk about the 7 assumptions that researchers make when they are using different instruments and tools of measurement. So I'm curious to know what you think about these assumptions and if there's any assumptions that you wonder about or that you're a bit more critical about. So the first one is this idea: in order to use these measures or educational or intelligence tests, you have to assume that psychological traits and states exist, and that also they can be quantified and that they can be measured. And that there's always error present in these tests. That one I think is probably a good assumption to make. And that the results from these assessments can be used to predict non-test related attitudes and behaviors. So this one didn't talk about personality, but if you take a personality test, it says you're extroverted, that should predict what your behavior is like in a social situation. This one I think is the most interesting to me, number 6, with much work and continual updating, that fair and unbiased tests can be developed. So this assumption is in many, well, so the bias part I think is interesting. So we know that there's always going to be error, but this one is talking about there's always the possibility of perfection in a way. So I'm curious if you think that that is possible, or if we should even be striving for that, or if instead we should be talking about the bias that is inherently present in our measures and what we can do about that. And that these tests can benefit society if they are developed in a way that ensures that they are reliable and valid. So on to the bulk of the chapter, which was about reliability and validity. So reliability is the idea that the instrument or the tool that is being used is consistent, meaning that it is getting the same results every time. So this little image here, it's like the temperature scale. So if it's reliable, they should all be getting the same one. So that's so important when you are either using a measure or developing your own measure, is to make sure that it is reliable and it's consistent. So the chapter breaks down several different components or types of reliability. So this one, test, retest, when the test is used again, that you are getting similar results. And for this one, the big thing to think about, and so if you are analyzing a study that has a pre and a post test, be on the lookout for the time in between. If it's too close, participants can remember the answer, which will skew the results. Or if it is too long, they could have just learned. And so this is another one for those of you who are familiar with the MAPS assessment. It's given 3 times a year. This is a test retest type of structure. And so they need to make sure that it is reliable and it's getting those results that they claim to be getting. equivalent forms. So if there's a version A and a version B, making sure that those forms are reliable in that one is not harder or easier than the other, so to speak. Internal consistency, meaning that the questions, if the measure is measuring one single construct, that all of those questions are reliably measuring that construct. And then Interscore reliability. So this is used oftentimes in studies that use coding as a method, where people are the ones that are providing, either using a rubric or a coding manual to analyze the data, making sure that the different people are scoring the same pieces of data the same to develop some type of reliability. So in studies that use that type of data, more nomial data, you will see them talk about Interscore reliability if they used a coding manual, talking about how that was developed and how they carried it out. And the text mentions that reliability needs to be empirically tested, and in order to be a measure that is deemed reliable. And so you will see those correlation coefficients describing the reliability. And so that's something that I want you to look out for in your article critique. Did they talk about the reliability of their measure? If so, what was it, and what do you think about the reliability of what they used? And then the next one is validity. And validity is so important because even if the measure is reliable, if it's not measuring what it claims to measure, then the data is not useful. So validity, how true is the results from the tool or the survey or the test? How true are they to what they claim to be measuring? So for instance, if it is an intelligence test, is it actually measuring intelligence? And then this kind of circles back to those assumptions with bias and how we deal with some of those things. So this is a little different grouping, but this is how I tend to think about validity. The text breaks it down even further, but construct validity, that is the overarching big idea. Does the measure elicit what it claims to? So it's so important with this to operationalize those variables as well, making sure that you're clearly defining what they are. So look out for that as well. And then internal validity, so this is something that you will be doing when you're critiquing the article. So all of us as consumers of research, that is part of our responsibility, and peer reviewers, is to examine research with a critical eye. Do we agree with the findings that they came up with based on the evidence that they presented? So that would be internal validity. And then external validity, can those findings be generalized to other populations? So maybe they found that a particular curriculum worked in one school. It would have external validity if it also worked in other settings. So here is how the text breaks it down even further than this. So based on content, and so then based on the internal structure. So that's what I was mentioning in terms of the results that the authors of the research found. Is it valid in terms of, does it match the evidence that they found? And then related to other variables. So when you look in the next slide, there's quite a few slides that go into depth about each of these. And so you can be on the lookout for that. And especially when you're reviewing your article, look for how the authors talk about validity and discuss what they did and what you think about it. And then for those of you who are planning either mixed methods or quantitative studies, there is a little exercise at the end of this chapter to get you thinking about your proposal. So you can start thinking about your variables and what they might be, and then start to think about measures. So if there are likely existing measures, and so when you're searching those educational databases that we went through in chapter 4 about how to do a literature review, you will find articles that are written about these measures and talk about the reliability of those measures if you hope to use them. Even if you're using something like MAPS or Georgia Milestones, you will find information about the reliability of those assessments. And so that's something important to consider. In this chapter, I didn't include this here, but there's also a lot of detail about educational and intelligence tests that you might use as a measure. So you can use that as a reference if you're considering one of those as your variables. Okay, and then chapter 8 is getting into the data collection process. So this to me is one of the most exciting parts of research along with data analysis. So data collection, so once you have your research topic, your purpose, your question, you've decided your design in terms of, is it quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, you can start to think about what type of methods you will use to collect your data. And so be sure when you are reviewing research that you understand what methods did these researchers use to collect the data. So the text breaks it down into 6 groups. Tests, which is covered extensively in chapter 7, those intelligence tests or educational tests that might be used. And a lot of you, based on your research proposal, are considering using tests as one of your data collection methods. Questionnaires, where they can either be closed or open-ended questionnaires, where you are giving that either electronically. Pencil and paper is just so rarely used anymore, but where you're giving participants this list of questions and they complete it on their own and give it back. And then again, the authors mentioned that these can be qualitative or quantitative data. So there's different types of data that can be collected, and the text does a great job breaking down what it looks like if it is a qualitative questionnaire versus a quantitative questionnaire. Same thing with interviews and observations. So interviews are when the researchers have open-ended conversations, or it could be a quantitative interview. And so there is more and this is where that iterator reliability will come in. There's more procedures in terms of how the data is categorized when the person responds. Focus groups, a group of people, observation, and then existing data. So within those interviews, so like I mentioned, the text talks about what the characteristics of a quantitative interview are versus a qualitative interview. So quantitative interview, the text kind of says it's basically like giving a questionnaire, but just orally. And so when you are looking at a quantitative interview, you will so an example of this would be like polling research. So when people call people on the phone during an election cycle and they ask them, what issues are you most concerned with? What's your likelihood that you'll vote for this candidate over that candidate? So they are collecting, even though it's an interview, they are collecting quantitative data because they have a way of categorizing it that they can make that data numerical. And in education, a lot of qualitative studies use interviews as one of their data collection methods. And the qualitative interview is open-ended. So for all types of interviews, the researcher will create what's called an interview protocol. So if you are considering using interviews as one of your data collection methods, you would create an interview protocol where you list out the questions that you plan to ask. And based on the theoretical framework or the perspective that you're using that's guiding your study, that will help you decide how you structure your interview, whether it's open-ended, whether it's more conversational, and then how you elicit follow-up questions. So that is interviews. And then focus groups, I didn't include that here, but focus groups similar to an interview, but the benefit of focus groups is you have more than one participant and they can build off of each other's perspectives and have more of a conversational style of an interview instead of just one-on-one. Now, observations. Observations can also be both quantitative or qualitative, and there's so many different techniques that researchers use when doing observation. And I'm going to share an example with you in the next slide. So when it is a quantitative observation, that's what I'm going to show you on the next slide. The researcher, they're using like time segments, maybe every like 5 minutes or 15 minutes. And they are looking for a specific behavior. So a researcher might be observing how 3-year-olds interact socially in a preschool setting. So they might be observing a class during their free play time, and they might make tally marks every 5 minutes if a child is playing by themselves or with another child. So they know that the interval that they're collecting the data, and then they are doing those tallies if they see the behavior or the presence of something or not. So that's how a quantitative observation would work. And now a qualitative observation is associated with an ethnography or in grounded theory. This is something that is often used as observing. And in qualitative research, there's a lot of different types of observations. So one way is the complete participant, where the researcher is immersed and they haven't even made it known that they are observing. Participant as observer. So in this case, the surrounding community knows that they're doing research, but they still are a real part of the community. Observer as participant, they come in as a researcher, and then over time, they start to become a part of the community, but they are still mostly an outsider. And then complete observer, where they are not part of that at all. So when we get to our qualitative article critique, I'll come back to this because that's something that you'll probably see a lot in those qualitative articles. And if you're considering doing a qualitative study and observation is part of your research proposal, you can start to take a look back in this chapter at these different types and think about how you would want to structure your observation if you're proposing that type of study. Okay, and then this is a type of data collection that I use probably most often, and that is using secondary data or existing data. I think I shared a few times that a lot of my research is about discourse. So I am collecting newspaper articles, media articles, images. Anything that is existing would be a secondary existing data. So it could be personal documents, official documents, policy documents. I know that, for instance, someone's research proposal was about uniform policies. So reviewing maybe a school's uniform policy, archived data over time, if you're looking at trends and how it has shifted, and then even physical data. So that is another source and another way to collect data. And so there's different methods that researchers use, like particularly if they're using something like geographic data, or census data, they will make very clear how they are collecting those data. Maybe the search term that they use, the time frame that they use, and how they search to collect it. And if you're interested, I can share more about some of my processes for collecting existing data. Okay, so I wanted to show you a couple examples. Let me make sure that you can hear. So, okay, I'll have to fix that in a moment. So this example is an example of systematic observation. So that would be quantitative observation. So let me fix my sharing so you can hear.
There are many, many social contexts that are having impact on us in any given day. The ones we're aware of that are making a difference for our behavior, it's only a fraction of what's actually influencing us.
In this study, we were most interested in the foods and beverages depicted in the most popular American movies from the last 25 years. So between the years of 1994 to 2018, these were movies like the Harry Potter movies, the Twilight series, a lot of Disney movies. We watched those movies and we just recorded every time that we saw a food or a beverage depicted.
Each of these foods were coded for their nutrition, content, and quality. And then those contents and qualities were compared against several different standards, including federal dietary guidelines.
Across the board, the foods and beverages depicted in movies fail U.S. dietary recommendations. So they're depicting more salt, fat, and sugar than what we should be eating, and particularly more alcohol than what we should be drinking.
There have been many studies in the field that show that just mere exposure to something, just having it enter your sphere of awareness over and over is enough for you to develop a positive association with it, to start to like it.
So when you see characters like superheroes or your favorite actors consuming foods, that can subtly influence our behavior, in part because they shape our mindsets about food, what's delicious and exciting to eat.
Of course, some movies have specific settings. You know, if you're showing a diner in the 1950s, it probably makes sense to show burgers and fries, but there's many times when the food or beverages depicted in movies aren't really relevant for the plot. And those are places where we could maybe be more mindful about the types of foods and beverages we're showing.
I think it's a really great opportunity for movie producers and actors to be empowered by these findings. Also to take more of a responsibility for the foods they portray on their screens for millions of people to see.
Okay, so as you can see, they coded during that time interval and correlated that with the nutritional value. So that's an observation example. The last example is an example of archival research, which is an example of secondary or existing data.
Most people, the interaction that they're going to have with a police officer is because if they're stopped for speeding or forgetting to turn their blinker on. There have been so many different interactions with police that have ended tragically. There was the arrest of Sandra Bland in Texas in 2015 that ended up with her dying in jail. There was the Minnesota stop with Philando Castile where he was shot and killed. Those are really egregious incidents. What is the everyday person's interaction with police like, and do we have problems there?
Our project started a couple years ago when we requested state-level records from all 50 states on traffic stops.
When research is done on just one particular jurisdiction, one city, or even one state, it's hard to draw larger conclusions about the state of policing in the United States.
We find that Black and Hispanic drivers are ticketed, searched, and arrested at higher rates than white drivers, even after controlling for location, age, gender, and year. The pattern is widespread, occurring throughout the country. These differences highlight a disparity in police practices. In and of themselves, these statistics do not, however, indicate discrimination. To go beyond these disparities, we test directly for bias in search decisions. We try to directly infer the standard of evidence that officers apply when deciding to search.
So for example, if officers search white drivers if there's a 10% chance or greater that they're carrying contraband, but search black drivers if there's a 5% chance or greater, this is going to be measured as discrimination.
Based on our statistical analysis, we find that there's a double standard. Black and Hispanic drivers are searched on the basis of less evidence than white drivers. At the end of 2012, both Colorado and Washington legalized recreational marijuana.
Since black drivers were more likely to be charged with drug-related offenses prior to legalization, the policy change mitigated racial disparities.
What's interesting is that the number of searches also dramatically declined in both states. In part, this is because legalizing recreational marijuana removed a common reason for conducting searches.
The data comes to you in a different format from every state. We came up with a standard set of columns, like the race of the driver, gender of the driver, age of the driver, whether a search was conducted, whether contraband was found.
There are a number of states around the country that collect information when a police officer stops an individual, but that data is not analyzed.
To help researchers, journalists, and policymakers explore these issues, we're releasing all of our data and all of the code we use to analyze the data. In total, we're releasing records for over 100 million stops across 31 states.
And providing the training to journalists so that they can think more effectively about how to cover race and policing.
This is just a first step in a complex process of understanding and improving police contact with the public.
Okay, so as you can see in that example, there are so many different types of scales that they discussed, different types of how she talked about how she organized the data in the columns, and they really went into depth about how they use that existing data. So I'm curious, what did you think about those studies, and what are some data collection methods that you're thinking of using in your study? Okay, and so in the next part, you'll have the review slides and your discussion questions. Talk to you soon.